Today, we're diving into de-dollarization, that big, bold shift where countries are trying to move away from relying so heavily on the US dollar for trade. It's a process that's really shaking up the global financial scene.
Exactly. And it's almost like nations are saying, we need to diversify. We need alternatives. Because being so dependent on one single currency, especially one as volatile as the dollar, can be really risky.
Absolutely. Think about it. The dollar has been the cornerstone of international finance for decades. But now, with de-dollarization, countries are exploring everything, from local currencies, alternative payment systems, to even virtual currencies, to loosen that grip.
Right. And when you hear about a potential dollar crash, it sends ripples through the whole system, doesn't it? I mean, if the dollar were to suddenly lose its value, the effect on global trade and investments could be enormous.
Oh, definitely. If the US dollar were to crash, you'd see an immediate shakeup in things like inflation levels, borrowing costs, and even exchange rate volatility. It's not just a US problem, it's a worldwide financial crisis waiting to happen.
Yeah, it's kind of surreal to imagine, right? Countries like Russia, China, and even Iran are already rethinking their strategies because they don't want to be trapped by these vulnerabilities.
Exactly. Russia, for instance, has been building up its gold reserves and cutting back on US Treasury bonds. It's a clear move to create buffer against the unpredictable swings of the dollar.
Right? And China is really pushing for the yuan to be used more in international trade, trying to carve out a niche where, they're less dependent on the dollar altogether.
Yeah. With initiatives like the Belt and Road, China is literally laying down the groundwork for alternative financial networks that bypass the traditional dollar-based system.
Now, stepping back a bit, it's interesting to reflect on how we got here. The dominance of the US dollar really took off after World War II, didn't it?
It did. The whole system was set up around the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the dollar was pegged to gold, giving it a kind of solid foundation. But once Nixon ended the gold convertibility in 1971, the so-called Nixon shock, the game changed completely.
And then the petrodollar system really locked it in further, right? Countries needed dollars to buy oil, which just ramped up the demand and kept the dollar as the default global currency.
Exactly. And that's why the prospect of de-dollarization is such a massive shift. It's like rethinking a system that's been in place for almost 80 years. With countries now prioritizing financial autonomy, the US dollar's dominance is being seriously questioned.
Right? But here's something I've been mulling over. Do you think de-dollarization can ever completely replace the dollar, or is it more of a balancing act?
That's a really great point. I see it more as a recalibration rather than an outright overthrow. Even if countries diversify their reserves, the US dollar is so embedded in so many financial systems that it might stick around in a reduced role rather than vanish entirely.
So, really, it's about building resilience, making sure that if the dollar stumbles, economies don't come crashing down.
Precisely. And that ties into what would happen if the dollar were to crash. Global inflation, higher borrowing costs, even severe impacts on international trade. Countries would scramble to find alternatives quickly, whether that means more bilateral trade in local currencies or forming entirely new financial alliances.
Speaking of alternatives, the input talked about several players like El Salvador with Bitcoin as legal tender, and even the European Union stepping up its game with the euro. That's really an interesting mix.
It sure is. Take El Salvador, for instance. By adopting Bitcoin as legal tender, they're experimenting with a whole new model of monetary sovereignty. It's a bold move to diversify and reduce dependency on traditional fiat systems.
Right? And then there's Venezuela, which threw its hat into the ring with its digital currency, the petro, as part of its push away from the US dollar.
Exactly. These moves, though diverse in approach, are all part of the broader de-dollarization wave. They signal a shift towards not just alternative currencies, but also towards a reimagined framework for global trade, one that isn't so dominated by a single currency.
Absolutely. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about currency devaluation. It's mentioned as a tool different from de-dollarization, right? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Currency devaluation involves a country intentionally lowering the value of its own currency relative to others, usually to boost exports. It's a tactical move, sort of like giving your products a discount on the global market. But of course, it has its
Yeah,
pitfalls.
yeah. Right, because while it might help exports, it can also lead to higher prices on imported goods and potentially spark inflation domestically.
Exactly. It's that classic double edged sword. On one hand, you're making your exports more competitive. On the other, you risk imported inflation and even capital flight if investors get jittery.
Mm-hmm. And that risk really escalates if you consider a scenario where the dollar crashes. The shock wouldn't just be about one nation devaluing its currency, it would be a global scramble to readjust values across the board.
Precisely. In such a crisis, you might see intense competitive devaluations, with countries trying desperately to stabilize their own economies. It could lead to what some would call a
Yeah,
currency war, where no one really wins in the end.
this interplay between de-dollarization and currency devaluation really highlights how interconnected our global financial systems are. A change in one pillar can really ripple through every market and nation.
Absolutely. It's all part of this intricate, almost delicate dance in global finance. On one hand, de-dollarization is about long-term shifts toward a more diverse monetary system. On the other, currency devaluation is an immediate policy move with both short and long-term consequences.
Exactly. And doesn't this rebalancing also have serious geopolitical consequences? It's not just economics. It's about altering, global power dynamics as well.
Spot on. As countries shift alliances and develop alternative payment systems, the geopolitical influence of the US could wane. But here's where I'd respectfully challenge you. While some argue this shift heavily undermines American power, the resilience and adaptability of the US financial system are also significant factors.
Right, true. I see what you mean. The US might face increased borrowing costs and reduced influence, but it could also innovate and recalibrate its policies to cushion the blow.
Exactly. It's a complicated, nuanced scenario. A dollar crash would be catastrophic in the short term, but in the long term, the forced move toward diversification might actually lead to a more balanced and resilient international system.
Yeah. And that long term shift means that de dollarization ultimately might not eradicate the dollar, but rather relegate it to one of several important currencies, right?
Precisely. The dollar may lose its exclusive status, but it will probably still loom large in international finance, albeit as part of a more diversified basket of currencies.
Right, absolutely. So, in a way, the move towards de dollarization is not about completely shutting the door on the dollar, but rather about building a safety net to protect against sudden shocks and um, ensuring stability in an unpredictable world.
Exactly. And that's why, even though a crashing dollar would trigger immediate economic chaos globally, with inflation, market instability, and geopolitical tensions, the eventual outcome might be a more balanced, multi currency system that could help avert future
That
crises.
makes sense. And while these shifts are risky, they also open up new opportunities for international alliances and innovation in global payment systems. It's like the old financial order is making way for a new, more diversified era.
Right? It's a radical, transformative process. There's a lot at stake, but also a lot of potential for creating a system that's less prone to those domino effects when one single
Yeah,
currency
very
takes a
true.
hit.
In the end, whether it's de-dollarization or currency devaluation, the global financial landscape is evolving. The challenges are immense, but so are the opportunities for building a more resilient and balanced system.
Exactly. It's an ongoing story of adaptation and transformation. As countries push for economic sovereignty and explore new financial technologies, we might just witness a reimagined global economy that is better equipped to handle future shocks.
Absolutely. Thanks for such an engaging discussion on this complex topic. It's always eye-opening to unpack the layers behind de-dollarization and the potential impact of a dollar crash.
My pleasure. It's fascinating to see how historical shifts and current innovations intersect to reshape our global financial future. Until next time, keep thinking about the dynamic dance of global economics.